All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to the sixth lesson in Black American Studies with me, The Forecast. And first, like I always do, I got to appreciate y'all and say thank you for all the support y'all show me. This does take a lot of work to do, so I appreciate all the love and the motivation y'all give me to keep going. So I appreciate y'all. And of course, I want to encourage others to create whatever kind of course that you think is necessary for our children, for them to be able to make the moves that they have to make in the future, so we can stop repeating the same cycles over and over and over. So if you got a course you want to teach in science and math and business, whatever it may be, I encourage everybody to create their own courses so we can start to put together our own curriculums for our children. Now, last time we touched a little bit on the door of no return and the slave trade and all of the rebellions that we saw on slave ships, right? Because people don't want to talk about that, how much they were actually fighting back. And according to their records, there were nearly 500 rebellions on slave ships, or at least recorded incidents, which could have been anything from somebody not listening to a full-on rebellion. But we saw a couple of cases of rebellions on slave ships. But we also saw how some tribes, like the Akwamu tribe, thought they were better than other Africans or other black people, right? And they helped Europeans capture other people and enslave them. But then when their king died, they got sold to the same people that they were selling others to. And we see how our disunity hurts us because they had a rebellion, they were successful, but because they wanted to enslave other black people instead of freeing everybody, nobody helped them, and they ended up losing to the European powers when they started working together. And this definitely seems like an age-old problem that we keep having over and over, thinking that they're our friends when really they were there to do business and enslave us, not be our friend. Now, we also saw the more rebellions there were, the more conspiracies that Europeans came up with, and the more white fear continued to grow. And we talked about the New York slave conspiracy of 1741. But another important thing that we talked about that I want to pick up here was the competition between European nations and their race to conquer and enslave the people. And that includes the land that we call the United States of America today. Like we touched on the French and New Orleans and Spanish Florida. And of course, we talked about Fort Mose, which led to things like the Stono Rebellion. Now, even though Georgia was originally a non-slave state, even though they did allow slavery in the state, but it was technically banned when it was first created. But by 1751, slavery had been legalized and they adopted South Carolina slave codes. Except they made a few changes from South Carolina because they didn't want the number of slaves to outnumber white people. They took steps to make sure that didn't happen, especially with Spanish Florida right there. But by 1775, the black population in Georgia grew from about 500 to 18,000. Now, last time we did touch a little bit about the slave ships, but most of the people got taken to the Caribbean and places like Brazil. But the sugar plantations in places like Jamaica or Saint Domingue and Haiti got the reputation of being some of the most brutal colonies. And often, slave owners would send the most rebellious slaves to places like Jamaica to get quote-unquote broken.
And I want to tell you about a section of history that has somewhat been hidden. Let's not forget, in our schools, we were taught that slaves were seasoned to work on the plantation, which simply meant they were broken into the system by being beaten. But let me get this straight. What Thomas Thistlebud did to the slaves, you will never imagine. And you could never imagine that someone could have done that to another human being. Never forget the name Thomas Thistlebud, because he created a dose that you could never imagine. A dose that was given to slaves. Seeking wealth in 1750, he decided to journey to the colony of Jamaica and settle in a place called Egypt in Westmoreland. He worked there as an overseer on 2 slave plantations. An overseer is someone who directs the slaves on their daily activities. He bought his first slave in 1756, and he also purchased land. One of Thomas's key attributes was his ability to document his daily activities, and he did so in great detail for over 30 years. In his diary entries, we can establish that he had a sadistic way of life, and he had a strong appetite for enslaved women. On analysis of his diary entries, it is estimated that he had over 3,800 sexual acts with over 138 women in 36 years in Jamaica. Based on the record, he seemed to have had a likeness to one slave called Phoebe. Thistlewood and other plantation owners believed that having sex with enslaved women would show white men's dominance over the slaves, of course. As a matter of fact, he started this when he was an overseer. He raped, beat, and murdered slaves. So when he got his own slaves, the treatment was not different, but more severe. Follow me again. Thistlewood was also known to have tied up his slaves, laced their bodies with molasses, and exposed the slave to mosquitoes and flies all night. Just imagine that. However, this punishment was far from what you could imagine. Thistlewood invented the Derby's dose. Yes, because this dose represents the lack of respect for human dignity. If a slave did something that Thomas thought was wrong, he would have the slave beaten, then lime juice thrown into the wound, and then the slave would be tied up. From Thistlewood's perspective, this punishment was not enough. So what he had other slaves do was to grab the slave who had committed that offense, tie the slave up in a position that would allow another slave to defecate in that slave's mouth. Of course, place their own feces, their body waste, into the other slave's mouth. And after that, the slave who had received the feces into their mouth had their mouths shut and gagged for 4 to 5 hours. And as a matter of fact, we all know if your mouth is gagged with an object or any item within, you are forced to swallow. That is very humiliating. Yes, Thomas Thistlewood must be known for what he did to black people in the Caribbean, and this story must be told for generations to understand the impact of slavery, its psychological impact on those who were victims of such treatments. Thomas Thistlewood also allowed slaves to urinate on other slaves in their eyes and in their mouths for punishment. He flogged slaves for just waking him up in the night. In another entry he made, he flogged 2 slaves for eating cassava that was prepared badly. He was just upset that they would not be able to work the following morning, although they almost died. One slave that seemed to have received so many doses of beating seemed to have been Lincoln. His name is mentioned countless times in various diary entries. But let me say that slaves found ways to deal with Thomas Thistlewood in a passive way. As a matter of fact, I called it passive resistance, and this is also reflected in our history books. They pretended to be ill. They ran away from Thomas. As a matter of fact, they sometimes planted crops incorrectly. Slaves will also cause injury to the plantation animals. They would damage or lose the tools for the plantation. These were just some of the many strategies employed by slaves to ensure that they resisted this evil institution.
Now, most of the punishments slave owners came up with in places like Jamaica was just straight up sick. And often they just did anything they can imagine. And eventually we'll see a few examples of when rebellious slaves was sent to Jamaica or threatened to be sent to Jamaica to be disciplined. Now, back in America, a 21-year-old Benjamin Banneker created the first fully functioning clock, and it was made completely out of wood. And he learned how to make it by taking apart a pocket watch and just looking at how it worked. And just by doing that, he made a fully functioning wooden clock.
While the Emancipation Proclamation was still a distant concept, the mid to late 1700s saw the establishment of the first black churches, cultural organizations, institutions for education of Negroes, and accomplishments of perhaps the most celebrated black man in the 1700s. Ahead of his time in a period that saw most still enslaved, Benjamin Banneker became an astronomer, clockmaker, surveyor, and advocate for equality. On this day in 1731, Banneker was born free to free parents on a 100-acre tobacco farm that they owned. He was educated at a Quaker school, one of the few institutions at the time to offer integrated education. At around 15 years old, Banneker developed an irrigation system for his family's land. His ingenuity would not stop there. In his 20s, Banneker built one of the first clocks in America. This caught the eye of a famous clockmaker who loaned Banneker scientific books and instruments for astronomical studies in exchange for Banneker's assistance. Banneker began planning agricultural methods and predicting patterns of weather. This led to him publishing a self-entitled almanac in 1792, the first book of science published by a black American. Banneker's almanacs also contained political writings in which he challenged the concept of democracy like few black men had. These writings called the attention of Thomas Jefferson. The two men exchanged several letters. In them, Banneker advocated for abolition by pointing out the hypocrisy of America's Declaration of Independence. As he pointed out, those who said all men were created equal were enslavers of men and women and children. At the end of his life, Banneker amassed arguably more accomplishment than any black man of his time.
Now, Benjamin Banneker was self-educated. He became an inventor, a mathematician, and an astronomer. And he is known as the first black scientist in the quote-unquote New World, although there were many black people already using science, but they just used it to fight back, so they didn't really count that. But black people have always used their knowledge of nature and science like chemistry to create poisons out of plants to fight back without being noticed, or to create weapons, or to do the things that they had to do to survive. But they credit Benjamin Banneker with being the first black scientist in what became the United States. Now, by 1758, the African Baptist Church, or the Bluestone Church, was founded on the William Byrd Plantation in Mecklenburg, Virginia. Now, some recognize it as the first black church in America, but others say the first black church was established in Prince George County in 1756, which they call First Baptist Church.
In the late 1700s, the city of Petersburg had a growing free blacks community. That community eventually housed the first black school for men, women, and children in a time when it was against the law for black people to know how to read and write. That school was also a house of worship that still stands today as a pillar in Petersburg.
First Baptist is the oldest church in North America.
Julian Green Jr. has been a member of First Baptist Church in Petersburg since 1972. In 1998, he became the church's historian.
Before there was a Declaration of Independence, before there was a U.S. Constitution, before there was a Continental Army, there was a First Baptist.
Founded in 1756 in Prince George County and officially organized after moving to Petersburg in 1774, making First Baptist the oldest black church in North America. This month, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources unveiled a marker highlighting the church for its historical significance.
To stay together all those times showed that there was a situation where the church had ingrained itself and the people likewise ingrained itself in Petersburg.
In its 260 plus years of service to its congregation, the church has survived wars and multiple fires, Green says, that were set by white supremacists.
This is how the church looked. When it was burnt, only this wall remained burnt and charred, and the wall on the outside.
Having been remodeled several times, the church still largely maintains its look from its previous two-story structures and still has managed to preserve many of its pieces that are up to 150 years old.
These are the original doors, center doors into the sanctuary. That organ goes back to 1870. That chandelier, we think, goes back to 1870, 1880.
Green also has a record book dating back to the 1870s.
Petersburg, Virginia.
1876.
Right, 1876. All the minutes for that meeting, for all the church meetings, is the minutes for the meetings in terms of what happened.
Today, First Baptist sees about 1,000 members to its weekly services, according to Green. The church on Harrison Street has stood the test of time and has been the place its flock could turn to throughout any period.
But you need one place that you can come and board your bearings and then sing and release your frustration. That was the church, and particularly and specifically the black church.
Now, most people use the black church to practice their own spirituality in secret, but they also used it as a place where they could meet and make plans and organize themselves. Now, of course, whites were so scared that there was going to be an uprising that they required a white person, an armed white person, to be there. But of course, that wasn't always the case. But since the black church was first created, it's been a place for us to meet and organize. Now, even though a lot of Europeans claim they were trying to escape religious persecution themselves and they were being persecuted in their homeland, they used Christianity and the Bible itself to justify their crimes. Now, some of the pilgrims in the North claim to be abolitionists, even though the North was the front runner for slavery in the first place, the first to legalize selling kids, really the first to legalize slavery itself. But the Quakers in Philadelphia forbid their members from participating in the slave trade. And in 1758, they even opened a school for black children, for free black children. Now, some of these so-called white abolitionists may have been against the institution of slavery, but that does not mean that they didn't think black people were inferior or less than or incapable of governing ourselves. But for the first time, these abolitionists, these white abolitionists, a lot of them were the first ones talking about white nationalism. And it wasn't about morality. Now, one of their heroes, who they try to claim was an abolitionist and loved black people, which he did not, was Benjamin Franklin. And, they call him a founding father and they talk about how he was such an abolitionist. But Benjamin Franklin was one of the first people to talk about white nationalism. And he was one of the first ones talking about, I'm not British, I'm a white American. In 1751, he wrote, the Anglo-Saxons and the English made up a principal body of white people on earth, and he wished to see their numbers increase. And he said, why increase the sons of Africa by bringing them to America where we have a chance to make it a white nation along with red, meaning Indians, by excluding the blacks and tawnies, who were basically like biracial, or it's like saying black and brown.
This consequence of availability of land forced farmers to turn to slave labor to ensure that they would always have enough labor to work their fields. However, Franklin explained in depth in Section 12 of Observations why slave labor is so grossly inefficient, pointing out that a slave owner has to pay to feed and clothe slaves, as well as to cover the cost of time wasted through inefficient work and the cost of items stolen by slaves. Although Franklin denounced slavery in Observations, he did so for economic reasons rather than moral ones. This is shown in Section 12 when Franklin asserted that every slave was by nature a thief, and in Section 24 when he wrote, why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks and tawnies of increasing the lovely white and red. But perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. In this excerpt, Franklin discussed his desire to increase the number of whites in the world by excluding blacks as well as other races from America. Franklin also owned slaves and published advertisements for slave sales in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette.
Now, I know a lot of people try to act like Benjamin Franklin was this white savior and an abolitionist in favor of black people. But like many abolitionists, it was for economic reasons. And a lot of times what they don't tell you is it was for white nationalist reasons, not for moral ones. Benjamin Franklin was arguing that slavery was hurting white people's chance to get jobs. And he referred to slaves as thieves. He said they all steal. But he was saying that Negroes that were brought into English plantations greatly diminished or hurt poor whites because they couldn't make a living. But he felt that anybody who acquired more land by removing, aka killing, whoever was already living on the land, so that more white people could live there, should be called the governor or the father of that nation, which was basically like the leader of the colony. Now, this is who they call the father of their nation and who they look up to. And they try to act like he was an abolitionist when really he was a white nationalist, which a lot of abolitionists were. And we got to start understanding that, because I know a lot of us think that we have white saviors and we have white friends and allies, but they're not there to be your friends. Now, the last thing that they wanted to see, and they still don't want to see it today, was a black man with a gun. And so by 1760, New Jersey forbids slaves and really black people in general from joining the militia. Now, even though it was illegal for black people to know how to read and write, a lot of people think that nobody knew how to read and write. But on the contrary, there were many black people who knew how to read and write, even during that time. In 1760, a brother named Brenton Hammond wrote the first autobiography of an enslaved person. And it was called A Narrative of the Unknown Sufferings and Surprise Deliverance of Brenton Hammond. And he talked about his experience working on ships, about his encounter with Indians in Florida, and just about his overall life. Now, another enslaved brother named Jupiter Hammond is recognized as the first black writer that was published in what became the United States of America after his poetry was published.
Jupiter Hammond was born into slavery on Saturday, October 17, 1711, at the Lloyd Manor in Queens Village, Long Island. The only information we have about his parents, according to a set of records called the Lloyd Papers, is that his father, who was called Opium, and his mother, who was called Rose, was documented as being the first set of male and female slaves to be purchased for servitude by the Lloyd family. His father was known for his many escape attempts, and outside of that, nothing else is mentioned or documented about his parents. By the time Jupiter Hammond is 14 years old, there's an estimated 75,000 African slaves in the American colonies out of 500,000 non-Native American residents. And although we know little to nothing about his childhood or early adult years, we do know that Hammond was raised to be a committed Christian in the likes of the Lloyd's family, whom he served. At some point, the Lloyd's family allowed Hammond to receive a rudimentary education through a religious organization known as the Anglican Church's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, also known as SPG. Its other goals were dedicated toward converting Native Americans and free as well as enslaved Africans to the Christian ideology. Owned throughout 4 generations of the Lloyd family, Jupiter Hammond, armed with an education and strong religious values, was a favorite servant, clerk, farmhand, and artisan in the Lloyd family business. His ability to read and write proved useful to his slave masters as it related to their commercial business. Due to limited information, I can't tell you exactly when he began writing poetry. However, when he did, Jupiter Hammond displayed a high level of intellectual awareness. He was able to safely create literature expressing his feelings on slavery by layering his message in metaphors and symbols. This became evident when on Christmas Day, at the age of 49, he wrote a poem titled An Evening Thought, The Salvation by Christ with Penitential Cries, composed by Jupiter Hammond, a Negro belonging to Mr. Lloyd of Queens Village on Long Island, the 25th of December, 1760. The poem appeared as a broadside in 1761 when he was 50 years old. Now, most people are under the impression that Phyllis Wheatley, an extremely talented slave from Massachusetts, was the first published African author in the United States. However, her first published book of poetry was published in London and not America, making Jupiter Hammond the first African American published in America. Now, with that said, he was a huge fan of Phyllis Wheatley. In 1778, Jupiter Hammond published a piece called The Kind Master and Dutiful Servant, a poetical dialogue, followed in 1782 by a poem for children with thoughts on death. These works would set the tone for Hammond's most notable work to date, a speech known as the Hammond Address, which was titled An Address to Negroes in the State of New York. Hammond delivered his message in 1786 at the inaugural meeting of the African Society in New York on September 24th at the age of 76. He was still a slave. He told the crowd that if we should ever get to heaven, we shall find nobody to reproach us for being black or for being slaves. He advised those who were slaves to be obedient to their masters and honest, upholding their Christian ideals despite the wretched circumstance of the black people in those times. Hammond also stated that while he himself had no desire to be free, he did wish that others, especially the young Negroes, were freed. According to Paul Royster, an editor for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Hammond's speech was initially published by the New York Quakers and was later reprinted by several groups opposed to slavery, including the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, because the strong religious motifs and ideas of gradual emancipation were moderate enough to be taken seriously by whites, but still firmly rooted in abolition. Hammond's full body of work includes 8 publications, 4 poems and 4 prose, all consisting of religious content. Hammond's death was not recorded. It is believed that he died within or before the year of 1806 and was buried separately from the Lloyds on the Lloyds family property in an unmarked grave.
Now, his writing was very controversial, especially among black people, because he thought he had a relationship with his enslaver, and he really didn't desire to be free. And he tried to tell other people to submit to their slave owners' will and just be overall good, submissive slaves. Now, he did get a lot of backlash, and a lot of people disagree with him. But he did also say he didn't think that young black people should be enslaved and they should get their freedom if they wanted to. Now, this brother was enslaved for life, right? And he thought he was a part of their family. But when he died, he couldn't even be buried anywhere near his enslaver's family. Although he was held for life, they had his father, and he didn't want to be free from them. But they ended up burying his body like kind of around the corner in some field in an unmarked grave. But even back then, they were still having the same discussions that we have today. And believe it or not, there were people who actually argued that they wanted to stay in slavery. Now, by 1762, Virginia had already limited voting to white males only, but this time they changed the law to make it more lined up with the white nationalist mindset, because this white nationalist trend was starting to take off. But even though we started to see this trend of white nationalism growing, it still didn't stop Europeans from fighting each other for control. Now, eventually, the British gained even more of an advantage than they already had after they signed the Treaty of Paris. Now, this treaty was to end the 7 Years' War, and y'all go take a European class for that, you know. But just know, no matter how many treaties Europeans sign with each other, they're going to always fight each other, always going to be white on white crime. So after the Treaty of Paris was signed, after this 7 Years' War, the British got even more of an upper hand. Now, essentially, after the treaty, the French was kicked out of everywhere in the New World except for Haiti. And Britain also took the French land in America everywhere east of the Mississippi except for New Orleans. So pretty much France was the biggest loser in this treaty. They were only left with Haiti and essentially New Orleans in the New World. Now, the British was also able to take Florida from Spain, which ended up devastating many slaves' hope of reaching freedom. And they essentially attacked Fort Mose. Now, many of the Indians actually preferred the French over the British, and they actually tried to help the French win. And an Indian war chief named Pontiac led an uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion.
The 7 Years' War between the Indians and colonists ended in 1763, but tension still simmered in the fertile Ohio Valley. Almost immediately, Ottawa Chief Pontiac and allied tribes waged war on English forts. Pontiac's warriors quickly took Detroit and soon controlled all but 3 of the British posts west of the Appalachians. But their success was fleeting. When British troops and colonial militias arrived from the other side of the mountains, they overwhelmed the Indians.
The British sent out relief expeditions, fought a few battles. There was one very bloody one in Pennsylvania called Bushy Run. But what really ended the conflict was a series of negotiations between the British officers and the native leaders.
Although the English crushed Pontiac's rebellion and with it the Indians' dominance of the region, the British decided to deter any further uprising.
The British were forced to start treating the natives with a certain amount of respect and as allies, even though they didn't really want to do that.
This policy angered the colonists who were hungry for farmland and the speculators hungry for land sales.
But by then, most of the tribes had already accepted the ways of the Englishmen, which included enslaving black people. So since they tried to align with the British, and they often used them to help stop slave rebellions, including the Stono Rebellion that we talked about. So the King of England, George III, issued the Proclamation of 1763 to set aside land for the Indians who had helped them. Now, this proclamation was supposed to stop Europeans from colonizing land west of the Appalachian Mountains. But of course, like any treaty or agreement, I'll give y'all one guess at what the Europeans did. Of course, ignored the law and continued colonizing. So in response, of course, the natives fought back. And they were fighting so effectively that word got back to Britain about how successful they were. So the British sent more troops to defend their colonies, but they felt that the colonists should pay for it. So when they sent the troops, they decided to raise the taxes to recoup their money. Now, we're going to touch on all of this stuff more in the next session because we're coming up on their quote-unquote American Revolution. But it was this rise in taxes mixed with this new white nationalism, I'm not British, I'm a white American attitude that led to their quote-unquote American Revolution. Now, in 1764, the British passed the Stamp Act, which taxed them on any product that has sugar in it, including rum. And you know that had to piss them off because we know how much they love their rum. So this same group who were currently enslaving men, women, and children, buying and selling families, splitting them apart. But now, all of a sudden, they were crying, talking about they were being subjugated because they had to pay taxes for the troops that they needed to go kill more Indians and take their land. Now, let me say that one more time, because this and that white nationalist mindset is what America's foundation was built on. Despite the law telling them they can't colonize land to the west, they continued to do so, which lead to Indians fighting them back. So they need more British troops to go kill the Indians and take their land and have more land to enslave the people on. And the British send them soldiers, but say you're going to have to pay to recoup this money, so we're going to raise the taxes, which made them angry, and now they're crying that they're being oppressed because they don't want to pay for the troops that they asked for or that they needed. But you know what they did? They ended up boycotting and refused to buy English goods. They used their money, their economic power to their advantage. They didn't need to see somebody get killed by the police in the middle of the street to talk about using their economic power. Just the taxes was enough for them to say enough is enough. After the British saw that they were trying to boycott, they ended up passing the first tax that affected every colony, which was called the Stamp Act. Now, they taxed every piece of printed paper from newspapers to business contracts, which they usually sold slaves and they needed business contracts. That paper was taxed, right? The documents for slaves, that was taxed. Even the traveling passes slaves were required to have was taxed. And of course, black people were required to have their freedom papers, and that was taxed as well. Every document, every single piece of paper with print on it was taxed. Anyway, the British also set up courts and appointed their own judges, and they required the colonists to provide shelter and food for the British soldiers anytime they came to their door. Right? They couldn't turn them away. They had to let them in the house and give them shelter and food. Now, this act led to the expression that you may have heard before: taxation without representation is tyranny. Right? That's where this saying was born at for the Europeans. Now, it caused so much outrage, the Stamp Act was eventually repealed. But then Britain passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which gave them the power to pass any law they wanted in the colonies at any time, including the Townshend Act. Now, the Townshend Act imposed taxes on stuff like paint, lead, glass, stuff like tea, and it gave British soldiers the right to search colonists in their homes anytime. So basically, it was like a stop and frisk law. Now, you see, even though these taxes was originally meant to pay for the troops that the Americans needed, but they didn't want to pay for the troops, they called that oppression. And it wasn't like they were going through slavery and Jim Crow, but you see, they didn't just accept it. And not paying taxes that you're supposed to pay was enough for them to have their quote-unquote revolution. But they sit there and tell you you're violent for not wanting to be killed, or that the Haitians were violent because they fought back, or Nat Turner or somebody was violent because they fought back. But their revolution was led by a bunch of white nationalists who didn't want to pay taxes. So at the First Continental Congress, they created a non-importation agreement basically to boycott the British. And then gangs like the Sons of Liberty led some pop-up rebellions against the British soldiers. And even British slave traders were boycotted. And it affected business so much that the slave trade went out of business in Philadelphia. But the white American colonists refused to give shelter to the British soldiers. And eventually the Massachusetts Assembly was dissolved because they refused to collect taxes. And it wasn't just the North. The Virginia House of Burgesses was also dissolved for not charging these thugs with treason, as they were instructed to by their crown. Even though the Virginia House of Burgesses was supposed to be dissolved, they just started doing it for themselves. And even though they condemned the British, they really just wanted to keep the tax money for themselves. Now, they teach you a lot of this stuff in American history, just not the black perspective of it. But a lot of these laws and white-on-white crime between the British and the American colonies, you can learn in their schools. Or you can just take a European or American studies course. But I did want to touch on it for a couple of reasons. Because not only did this lead to the quote-unquote their American Revolution, a lot of black people saw how these white colonists were handling what they called oppression. And they saw them talking about liberty or death, right? And we're going to see a lot more of that in future lessons when we get further into this. But we want to look at some of the things that they don't teach us, right? From our perspective. And touch on some of the details that they might not tell us about. Because while they say that they were being so-called oppressed by the British, they continued to pass laws designed to destroy or break black people. In 1769, Virginia passed a law that required slaves to be castrated if they were accused of raping a white woman. And we know how that story goes. I would even say in the history of America, more white women have probably raped black men than the other way around, right? And of course, slaves were usually punished with castration for something like that, but now it was a law that required it. Now, we touched on some of the beginnings of their quote-unquote revolution, their American Revolution. But before we stop, it's a couple of more things that I want to mention that I think is important in this lesson. Now, how many of you have heard the name Crispus Attucks before? And I'm sure if you heard the name, how many of you have heard that Crispus Attucks was the first person to die for America, the first person to die in the Revolutionary War? Now, have you ever asked yourself, how did you know that? How could you know who was the first person to die in what was supposed to be some kind of melee or chaos event? Now, their feud between the British and the white Americans, right there, the white-on-white crime, led to constant clashes. And in 1770, a group of British soldiers ended up firing into a crowd, killing 5 people in what they call the Boston Massacre. Now, I don't know how it was a massacre, only 5 people were killed, but, that's how they worded it. And one of the people who they killed was Crispus Attucks.
His name will go down in history. But who is this man? Boston, 1770. A mob, angered by rising taxation imposed from London, confronts British troops. As tensions rise, the first shots of the American Revolution are fired. The first to die is Crispus Attucks. His name will go down in history. But who was this man, and why did he put himself in the line of fire? Born into slavery to an African father and a Native American mother, Attucks first enters the history books in 1750, when the Boston Gazette reported that he had run away from slave owner William Brown. Having managed to evade capture, Attucks struck out for a new life as a free black man. He had become a sailor and was serving as part of a crew in Boston by 1770, when tensions were running high in the city. British soldiers had been sent there to enforce the much-hated Townshend Acts, which had increased taxes on American merchants. Tensions rose further when, in February 1770, an 11-year-old boy was shot dead by the Brits who were breaking up an unruly crowd. On the evening of March 5th, the town was on edge. As a result, Attucks was lionized by American patriots, who used his image as a symbol of resistance against British rule. And during the 19th century, abolitionists used Attucks as an icon to protest against slavery.
Now, what they don't tell you is Crispus Attucks was referred to as a mulatto, and he was black and Indian. But I've heard some people say that he was full-blooded Indian. But up until this point, they referred to him as mulatto. Now, Crispus Attucks was a runaway slave who had made it to Boston, and he may have thought he was equal to them and just another colonist, just like another white boy. And he ended up getting involved in a mob after a British soldier allegedly hit somebody at a bar. So after it escalated, that's when they fired into the crowd, killing 5 people, and the British soldiers were arrested. Now, it's crazy who actually represented the British soldiers, because John Adams, who eventually became the second president, agreed to be the British soldiers' lawyer and defend them.
When an angry mob gathered in Boston to protest against rising taxes imposed by the British Parliament in 1770, things got out of hand and turned violent. British soldiers, the Redcoats, opened fire, and 5 people died. So why did the fierce patriot and future president John Adams step forward to defend the soldiers in court? At the time, Boston was a hotbed of anti-British sentiment. Many Bostonians believed it was unfair that colonists paid taxes to the crown without representation in the British Parliament, where issues that directly affected their lives were decided for them. Those frustrations often spilled over into violence directed at businesses that boycotted the protests and soldiers patrolling the city. And on March 5th, the Redcoats responded by firing their muskets into a mob of around 400 angry protesters. 5 died, including Crispus Attucks, the first death of the American Revolution. In the wake of the Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, 8 British soldiers and their officer, Captain Thomas Preston, were indicted for murder. But finding a lawyer for them was not easy, until 34-year-old John Adams agreed to represent them. Despite a very public backlash, which included threats of violence against him and his family, Adams believed that a fair trial would show the British that the colonies were able to take care of their own affairs. By arguing that the Redcoats' commanding officer had not ordered his men to fire into the crowd, and that the remaining soldiers had acted in self-defense, Adams was able to argue a case for reasonable doubt, a standard of proof used for the first time in a North American court. It meant it could not be absolutely proven that the deaths were intentional. As a result, 6 of the soldiers and Captain Thomas Preston were found not guilty of murder. 2 were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
Now, they make a bunch of excuses for him, but it does sound kind of treasonous to me. But, you know, they elected somebody like that to be their second president. But it does sound pretty treasonous. But during the trial, John Adams tried to make it seem like the crowd was attacking him. Now, the thing is, John Adams made sure to single out Crispus Attucks, arguing that his quote-unquote mad behavior is what escalated the event, or escalated the conflict. Now, even though the incident had supposedly started at a bar after the British soldier hit somebody, but if it was as chaotic as he made it seem, there's no way they could know who got shot first. And if everybody was throwing stuff at him and coming at him, they wouldn't know who attacked who first. Before the trial, Crispus Attucks was called mulatto or Indian, but John Adams said the Negro started the mob and he was attacking the soldiers with a club. Essentially, John Adams was the first to argue that the soldiers feared for their life and they fired in self-defense. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? But he was the first one to take that approach and essentially laid the blueprint for the I fear for my life self-defense. And I think they still use this blueprint to this day. And I'll give you one guess at the result of the trial. Yep, every British soldier was acquitted for the shootings, although 2 were convicted for manslaughter. Now, throughout the years, especially during wartime, different groups of white people used Crispus Attucks in different ways. Some use it to say, this is why we shouldn't arm Negroes, and look at the violence they cause. While others, including abolitionists, the white abolitionists, used his death to justify their white nationalist views in their argument against slavery. But one thing's for sure, even though Crispus Attucks was referred to as mulatto and Indian before the trial, after the trial, all you hear him talked about is as a Negro who was the first one to die in the war. But they won't tell you those British soldiers who caused their quote-unquote massacre was released because they blamed it on the black man being the first one to die in the war, because apparently he started it. Now, before I end here, because I do want to wait until next week to start going more into the quote-unquote American Revolution and our experience during that revolution, I do want to mention a couple of things that we talked about before, including black writers. And I do want to mention Phillis Wheatley, and we're going to talk about her a little bit more on the next lesson. But in 1773, Phillis Wheatley's book of poems was published, making her the first black woman published in the quote-unquote New World, although she had been published in England before. But while all that was going on in Boston, she became the first black woman to be published.
Hammond was such an admirer of Phillis Wheatley that despite never meeting her, she would be the inspiration for his second work to appear in print, which was titled An Address to Miss Phillis Wheatley. He was in the hopes that his dedication poem would encourage Wheatley along her Christian journey.
But like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about her next time and her writing, because her writing is somewhat controversial, like Jupiter Hammond's writing. And there's debate about it, so I definitely want to have that discussion. But I also mentioned black churches earlier, so I do want to mention, in Silver Bluff, South Carolina, free and enslaved black people established their own church in 1773.
As the free black community slowly began to grow in the years before the Declaration of Independence, the first institutions that they created, along with their enslaved sisters and brothers, were houses of worship. One of the earliest was in Savannah, Georgia. Today, It's known as the First African Baptist Church.
Reverend, I feel like I'm in the presence of Black church religious history. Tell me the story of this church. It's like a miracle.
Well, the church actually had its beginnings in 1773 when George Liao, who was a slave, was granted permission to preach up and down the Savannah River. In August of 1777, he was able to obtain his freedom. He was able to also constitute the church. That same year.
You know what I love about this church? I always, whenever I go into a Black church, I look to see what color God is, what color the angels, what color is Jesus. Your saints are your predecessors who founded and perpetuated the tradition. I think that's brilliant.
This sanctuary actually would not have been built if it had not been for Andrew Cox Marshall, who preached for 44 years about how he wanted to build a brick church, not just the temporary wooden buildings that had been built. When we think of those who built the church, definitely of recent African descent, this building has so many symbols in it that are codes for various things in the windows and the ceiling, on the side of the pews.
After long days of labor, the free and enslaved members of First African Baptist worked through the night to create a home in which to worship their God. The people who built these pews paid homage to Christ, but also left a surprising trace of another African religious past, Islam.
Now, one of the co-founders of the church, George Liao, who was formerly a slave, became the first ordained minister in Georgia. And then he trained another enslaved man named David George, who often went around preaching to other slaves trying to convert them. But like I said, the Black church was an important place, especially during that time, for Black people to be able to meet, organize, or even practice whatever kind of spirituality they wanted. But as their quote-unquote American Revolution went on, many Black people in the area, including these preachers, ended up leaving for Nova Scotia. But of course, the church is still here today. But we'll end it right there. And next week, we'll pick up on their quote-unquote American Revolution and see why many Black people went to Nova Scotia and see how their quote-unquote revolution affected us. And we're going to also mention Phyllis Wheatley and some of her stuff, her writings. And of course, we'll discuss y'all boy, good old George Washington, right? See if he ever told the lie in his life. But we also going to talk a little bit about that German pseudoscience to justify racism, which is starting to appear around this time. And hopefully we'll have time to touch on a few other things too, including more about those quote-unquote good old white abolitionists who were really basically white nationalists, as we saw with people like Benjamin Franklin. And we also going to talk a little bit more about Jamaican slavery and how people like George Washington used to threaten to send his slaves to places like that for them to get broken, quote unquote. So, we'll continue on with all of these lessons. But if you have any question about this session or any of the previous sessions, and I encourage everybody to go back through all of the lessons to get the complete story. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And again, if you could come up with some kind of course, whether it be teaching people how to run a business, it be a math course, it be simple chemistry, whatever it may be, teaching people how to write, whatever it may be, I encourage all of us to start putting our courses together for our children so that they can be prepared for the future and have the right mindset. Because it's not just being educated, it's being educated with the right mindset. So I appreciate everybody, and I'll see y'all again next week. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.